Well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tim Carter. I'm the president of Second Nature. Really glad that you're joining us for this really a three-part webinar series on COP27 and the preparations leading up to COP27. We're really grateful that you're joining us. I'm actually in New York City for Climate Week. I would normally be up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where one of our offices are based. And that area of Massachusetts is the home of the Nipmuc and Wampanoag peoples. And I just want to acknowledge at the beginning that the history of genocide of those native peoples is probably no more profound than in Cambridge, Mass. One of the original institutions, Harvard University, is on the lands of those peoples. And we know Harvard is doing a lot to address these historic issues, as well as many of the entities that are up there. And I know many of you are working on indigenous issues as well. So I just want to recognize that at the front end. I actually don't know where I am here in Manhattan, what the unceded land is, but that's we'll drop into the chat a little link for you to take a look at that from where you are. But before we get started, I just wanted to first of all acknowledge the partners that put this all together. So we are from Second Nature. We're a network organization that helps support many of your institutions that do really aggressive climate work, setting aggressive climate targets and meeting those goals. We have one of our networks is called the University Climate Change Coalition. So it's about 22 universities from across the Mexico, US, and Canada. And so members, Beth is one of the members of the UC3, and they're a partner on this, as well as the Ringo constituency. And Ringo is, as you'll, I'm sure, hear more about, an important part of the UNFCCC process. So the title of this webinar is the overview of the UNFCCC negotiation process and structure. And at the end, I'll let you know about the future webinars that are upcoming. So there's 2 more in this series, and this is the first one to start. Just a little bit of housekeeping. So we are recording this. So no one in the chat or in the questions has to say, will this be recorded? Like, it will be recorded. We're going to post it online. You might have to give us a day or 2 after this is done, but we'll post it online at secondnature.org, so you'll be able to access it. That's important for you to know. Second thing is important for you to know is that we do want questions. I know Beth and Tracy are very interested in hearing your questions and addressing those questions. And please use the question and answer function in Zoom. Many of you, hopefully everyone now is familiar with that function. It's Q&A and it has little bubbles in the middle. So the panelists are going to keep an eye on that. They'll mainly focus on their presentation, but they're going to keep an eye on that throughout their talk, and we'll try to get to as many as we can and pull out some themes the best we can. So you can add them at any time all throughout this session. And then lastly, it doesn't matter if you holler or make noise or anything because you're on mute anyway. So we're not going to take verbal questions. It'll just be written questions. I think that's all for logistics. So really honored and thrilled to have these 2 speakers, 2 co-focal points of Ringo. And there couldn't be any 2 people I could think of that are better positioned to talk about this topic than Beth and Tracy. Beth Martin is a teaching professor of environmental studies and the director of the climate change program at Washington University in St. Louis. And Tracy Bach is a co-focal point as well and a visiting professor at Washington University, as well as an advisor in the Tuck School of Business in Dartmouth and an affiliated faculty at Moravian University, and joining us from neither of any of those places. So Tracy, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and look forward to hearing what you guys have to share with us.
Thanks, Tim. Really appreciate it. So while Beth is teeing up our slides, I want to first of all, of course, say good evening, which is where I am, good morning, and good afternoon, where many of you are right now. It's great to have you here. Our goal tonight is to help everyone, help you all who are here, engage with the COP. And we have a particular focus on newcomers. But in our opening presentation, we'll provide a baseline by overviewing what you see here, the international climate change regime, COP meeting structure and decision-making, observer attendance and different ways they can engage, and navigating the COP. And we also have a number of tools and resources to recommend. And so what we'll do is start with this baseline and then look forward to answering your more specific questions in the last 15 minutes. Next slide, Beth. So I have the pleasure of introducing the climate change regime in under 10 minutes, which is going to be a new land speed record, but I'm setting my timer. So what I'm going to talk to you about briefly are 1, the 3 treaties, 2, key principles that govern those treaties and are laid out in particular the Framework Convention, and 3, how those treaties influence governance and organizational structure. Next slide. So I mentioned 3 treaties, and here they are laid out on a timeline. The UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, often referred to as just the convention or by the letters, is that baseline. It's the starting point for the later adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted in 1997, and then the Paris Agreement, which I'm assuming most of you have heard quite a bit about, which was adopted in 2015. You'll notice that on this slide that there's a difference between adoption, which is at that meeting, usually a COP, where the agreement or treaty is adopted by a COP decision. But then there's a period of ratification that has to happen both internationally and nationally, domestically of parties. So that's why you see the entered into 4 states. And then the last piece you'll see here is there is an array of parties who have committed to each of these treaties. So it's not a given that because, for example, a country ratified the convention, that it would also have ratified the Kyoto Protocol. A notable example would be the United States. And it's in fact because of those countries that didn't ratify the protocol that the parties worked on a different structure in the Paris Agreement. So Beth, let's go to the next slide. And in these next 2 slides, I want to give you a thumbnail really of each of the treaties that I think will most influence your engagement with COP27. So like we said, the convention has 198 parties. One of the things you'll just want to look at is that that includes countries as well as regional integrated economic entities like the EU. The EU is the only one that is that way. But bottom line, it's near universal membership of the countries in the world. I think the key thing to take away from the Framework Convention is 1, it was intended to get countries to start working on the problem. So remember, it was first adopted in 1992, long before we have the most recent IPCC reports telling us exactly pathways that we should do to stay closer to a 1.5C. So what you see here is that in Article 2 of the convention, you get a qualitative goal, not a quantitative goal. Keep that in mind when we flip to the Paris Agreement. Second, you get principles laid out in Article 3 of the Framework Convention that then subsequent treaties, the protocol and the agreement, carry through or adopt. The heart of the convention comes in Articles 4 and 12, which basically laid out the commitments that countries said they would take. And notably, they were differentiated commitments, with Annex 1 developed country parties having one set and non-Annex 1 countries having a different set. Finally, the last point on this slide is that the governance structure that's laid out in the convention's Articles 7 through 10 creates a secretariat, creates COPs, creates a subsidiary bodies. That structure has carried through with both the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So it's an umbrella. So next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on the Paris Agreement, and I want to be clear, it's not because I'm trying to disregard the importance of the Kyoto Protocol, but I think at COP27, most of us will be more engaged with the COP, which stands for the Conference of Parties, and 27 means the 27th, and that's the Conference of Parties of the Framework Convention, and then the CMA. And I'm forgetting the number for the CMA, Beth. CMA 4, okay, 4, which means which means the fourth meeting of the Conference of the Parties, the C, Conference of the Parties of the members of the Paris Agreement. So that's how you get the CMA. Okay, so the Paris Agreement, why is it different? Well, first, how's it the same? Like I said, the governance structure is the same. We still rely on the same subsidiary bodies. There's some new constituted bodies. We rely on the Secretariat to manage everything. And the principles carry through. So I wanted to point out to you in the second bullet point that in particular, the UNFCCC principle that's articulated in Article 3 of the Convention about common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, now framed with an additional clause in the light of different national circumstances, that's in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So it's referencing the Article 3 principles. But what is different? Well, one, remember that qualitative goal in Article 2 of the Convention? Well, now it's a much more quantitative goal, and it's a 3-part goal. So we always talk about the temperature limits, right? Well below 2C in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. And of course, striving to stay within 1.5C. But it also has an adaptation component to that. I think it's actually called an objective, not a goal, as well as a financing objective. So it's a 3-part objective in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. What else is different? So as compared to the Article 4 commitments in the Convention, which were a lot about process, sharing information, filing reports, and not mitigation or adaptation commitments, not hard, firm ones that were numbered, like in the Kyoto Protocol, which shot for and achieved in the first commitment period a 5% reduction overall of emissions of developed country parties. So what does the agreement do differently? Well, it establishes these nationally determined contributions. You're going to hear NDCs as much as you'll hear UNFCCC and a host of other acronyms. And what that means is that those country parties have committed to filing a report or a pledge, essentially, every 5 years of their nationally determined contributions, both from mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And that they commit to a process then of revising them every 5 years and being more ambitious. Well, how do you do that? Well, one, or actually 4 in bullet point 4, the Paris Agreement established an enhanced transparency framework. And what was key was both for action, like mitigation reductions, and support, like providing capacity building and finance and technology transfer. And that transparency framework applies to both developed and developing countries and is leading to an increased amount of information so that if you jump down to somewhere in there up at the end of that, so that it will feed into an every 5-year process of taking a stock, what's called the global stock take, where you assess overall, not by individual country, but overall in working toward those NDCs, have we as parties to the Paris Agreement achieved that well below 2C and striving for 1.5. Paris Agreement also was different from, thanks Beth, the Paris Agreement was also different from the Convention in that it set out a separate loss and damage article, which was key, and also set up a global adaptation goal. And then finally, it set up a new market mechanism. So now, Beth, if you could go to the next one, that'd be great. I'm going to just leave this here because I think what it does is illustrate some of that verbiage on the last one. So what you see is basically, let's look at 2020, which actually took place in 2021 because of COVID. But that was a point at which NDCs that had been filed under the Paris Agreement were due to be revised and countries were to submit new ones. And then 3 years later, with all the data received through the transparency mechanism and other sources like the IPCC, there will be a global stock take. And that's what's coming up next year, not this COP, but the next one. And so what you can see then is what's called this ratchet mechanism or ambition enhancement that gets us to further with the logic being
All right, I'm going to jump in to keep us going. Tracy let us know ahead of time that there were severe thunderstorms in her area that might mess with her Wi-Fi. So what Tracy, oh, she's back. Tracy.
Yeah.
You froze. Okay, you froze again. So I'm going to finish the slide, but essentially the logic being that the stocktake provides an assessment of the cumulative effect of all of the NDCs. It doesn't evaluate a particular country, but it evaluates the collective efforts towards meeting, reducing global temperatures. And so the idea, oh, okay, go for it, Tracy.
Yeah, so I'm sorry.
Team.
Yeah, I apologize. We're having a rainstorm here, and I think my internet went out for a moment. So I didn't hear what Beth said, but the key point here is to think about that the logic of the Paris Agreement, this bottom-up treaty, is having countries make pledges in the form of the NDCs, and then evaluate that through all the reporting that's taking place from all the parties, as well as outside reporting from entities like the IPCC. And then in every third year, so you see 2020 is the pledge year, 2023 is when they take global stock, the stock take, which is Beth just described beautifully. And then based on that, then all countries know how much ambition they need to increase. And in this way, the idea is to keep ratcheting up, or we might say down, until we get to carbon neutrality and climate resilience. That's the theory. Next slide. So I already talked about common but differentiated responsibility, so I'll move on to the next one, Beth. The last piece here, and I realize, Beth, I'm running a minute over time because of the delay, the rain delay, literally. But I want to take a moment and just point out what is a relatively complex graphic, but is brand new and is from a book chapter that Beth and I have just written, and it's being published by Cambridge University Press in the coming year. Basically, I think it helps you understand as you're navigating a COP, how to understand the overall UNFCCC structure. If you look at the right-hand column, right, you'll notice that there are these things called plenary bodies. Well, those are the COPs of the Paris Agreement, what we call the CMA, the COP of the UNFCCC, and the CMP, which is the COP of the Kyoto Protocol. And all three bodies will be meeting at what we shorthand as COP27. Beneath that, in gray, you'll see a bureau, which we could talk about more if you're interested, but I want to focus on the two subsidiary bodies. Those are entities, if you think of a COP as like a legislature, that each year is coming together and refining the treaty commitments, that the subsidiary bodies are doing that nuts and bolts work to process the information to make good decisions. Well, what's happened recently, and I'm only going to touch on this by saying it, because we have all of webinar 2 devoted to this, where we'll talk about subsidiary bodies, and in particular, all the green, pink, blue, purple, yellow that's in the middle, what are called constituted bodies. And simply put, they are topic-specific ad hoc bodies that were created by COP decision because the COPs realized they needed to work in a more focused way on those issues. For example, the Adaptation Committee or the Standing Committee on Finance. Finally, at the bottom, I want to point out that gray area, the Secretariat. That is the entity that staffs all three treaties and keeps us moving forward. I know I went through this very quickly. Happy to take questions on this, and let me now pass off, I think, to Beth, right? Last thing, sorry. The last thing to keep in mind, okay, 198 parties we say, but they can't all talk even in sequence, let alone at once. And so what they do is they've organized themselves into negotiating groups. And this is a beautiful graphic produced by Jonas Haller. And I think it shows you a couple things. One, there's about 15 or so major groups, and they usually speak first, especially those that don't have any overlapping members. Second, there's a lot of overlap, especially if you look at an entity like the G77, which was 77 countries at the beginning, but is now over 130. So it's one thing that I think the takeaway here is to keep this in hand, especially if this is one of your first COPs, and to always understand that when a party is speaking, whether they're speaking on behalf of one of these larger negotiation groups or themselves. Thanks, Beth. Now I'll turn it over to you. You're on mute, Beth.
Somebody had to do it at some point in time during the webinar, right? So you're welcome. So I'm going to shift a little bit to how does the work actually get done at the COP meetings? And like Tracy said, our second webinar is going to focus really in on those constituted bodies, which is a lot of where the work happens throughout the year on particular issues. But I know many of you are probably curious about, like, okay, going to COP, what's happening, and how do I understand what's happening, and how do I be where I want to be to learn what I want to learn or to do what I want to do. So the first slide I wanted to highlight is just a rough schematic of what all happens at a COP meeting. So within the big blue bubble is the space at which you would need a badge, right? So I'm sure many of you have heard the question of, do you have a badge, or am I badged, or have you been nominated and certified as a delegate through your observer organization? If that's the case, you have a badge, you get to go into the blue circle. In the blue circle is where all of the negotiation space, all the negotiations with respect to the treaties and the agenda items that fit underneath of those treaties that Tracy just mentioned. You'll also have side events, which is like a typical academic conference for sharing of information relevant both to what's happening in the negotiations, but also sometimes about what people want to be in the negotiations or how they might want to be or see that. The media, the press are visible there. There's often exhibits and also country offices and pavilions. So each of the different parties will have their own offices, and many parties, and as well as NGOs, will have pavilion spaces. And in those pavilion spaces, they're able to highlight the work that they're doing and specific work that they're doing. Also, outside of the badge zone is where you will have offsite events. Where badge isn't required, but you might have to sign up or pre-register. And also the green zone. And we don't have a lot of information on the green zone. Tracy's going to talk we don't have a lot of information, so she's going to mention it again in the future. But the green zone is also very often where the host country is able to share a lot of what is important to them, and also invite members of the public to come in and learn about the process as well. So this gives you a little sense of all of the things that are going to be happening in a COP meeting. But what I want to focus on for the next several slides is this orange circle, is these meetings within the orange circle. So the first meeting and so what I'm going to talk about is the types of these different meetings at which negotiations happen, and what actually can happen at those meetings. So the first type of meeting is a plenary meeting. And this might very well be, particularly if you walk in the COP the very first day, the first type of meeting you'll encounter. So the plenary meeting, like Tracy said, is the meeting of the governing body. So that can be a plenary with the COP, the CMP, the CMA, but also for the openings of the subsidiary body meetings. So they'll be done in plenary form as well. And so during plenary meeting, decisions are taken by the governing and subsidiary bodies. And those can be procedural decisions, like you might see at the beginning of a COP, such as adopting the agenda. Sometimes goes smoothly and sometimes can be quite interesting. So adopting the agenda, organizing the work of the session, how are we going to get through all of the agenda items that we have in front of us for the next 2 weeks? And then at the end of the session too, it's also in plenary where those substantive decisions and conclusions are actually adopted and agreed upon by the different parties. So the next type of meeting I want to highlight is a contact group. And if you imagine you've got a plenary with this big agenda and a lot of work to be done. So the plenary will send the work to different bodies to get to be done and conducted in different levels. So the contact groups often will coordinate when there's work that crosses over between agenda items. They can also hold negotiations, or they can serve as kind of almost a sub-plenary, and they can delegate work or move work down to the informal negotiations. Contact groups are usually open to observers, though access can be restricted. Plenaries will always be open. Contact groups, informals, which is the one I'll talk about next, usually open, but always can be closed at the request of a party. The next type of meeting I want to highlight, and this is one that I spend a lot of time in, as well as my students that attend, are the informals. And these are agenda-specific spaces where the negotiations occur. So in an informal, for example, you'll have a plenary that says, we're going to do work on agenda item 3. Agenda item 3 will happen in informal sessions, the first to be held on this day and this time. And so they're essentially doing, and they'll do that for all of the different agenda items, sending those agenda items to different spaces to be negotiated. So then within that space, you have co-facilitators and all of the parties that are interested and have an interest in that particular topic and the outcome of that topic. Typically, the informal sessions will be open to observers. So when we say open, or when I say open to observers, it means you can sit and listen and observe. It does not mean participate. I want to be clear about that. It means you can attend, sit, and listen and observe. When work happens in informals, the idea is at the end of the series of informal sessions, there will be the work will have achieved a certain status. Maybe it is a draft decision that will then be pushed back up to the governing bodies, right? So it'll go back up to one of the SBI or the substa, and then up to the COP or the CMA, where a final decision would occur. So the next type of meeting is informal informals. And yes, these names, there's lots of fun names in all of these sessions, but these are also called INF-INFs. So informal informals will occur when there is maybe not enough time within the informal sessions, or there are tricky little issues that need to have some dedicated time for parties to work on. So that can be text drafting, divergences in text. They're usually scheduled during the informal meeting. They'll pop up. They're typically closed to observers. They're not facilitated. They're not official meetings in that manner. So they're not posted. And work that happens in those will come back in to the informal sessions. Okay, quickly, I know my turn to run a little long on time, but the next session is huddles, and huddles are kind of fun. You can see huddles in all of the different types of sessions that I've mentioned. You'll see a huddle in a plenary. You may see a huddle in a contact group or an informal. Oftentimes, though they can occur at any point in time, oftentimes you'll see them at crunch time when parties are stuck or really trying to come to terms on, okay, we have 30 minutes left. We have to come into agreement. We're not agreeing. We've done our informals. We've had some INFIPs. We're still stuck. The co-facilitators will say, let's take a break, huddle, see what you can come up with. The negotiators will get up and, looking just like this picture, kind of walk to the corner, and they'll start hashing it out. And trying to kind of figure out how can they come to some type of consensus so that the work continues to move forward and doesn't stall out. So along those lines, and I just mentioned consensus, how are decisions made in this context? And within the UNFCCC, decisions are made by consensus. So consensus, the UN official definition, is a procedure whereby a conference takes a decision without a vote. It's distinct from unanimity, and then it can coexist with differing views to a degree. I like to kind of frame it as, it means nobody hates it enough to object or say no. It doesn't mean everybody likes the decision. It doesn't mean everybody necessarily votes for a decision, but it means that they're not willing to stop it from moving forward. And so the chairs will say, you'll hear in a session, hearing no objections, and a decision will be gavelled in. So I am going to, I'm going to pass off to Tracy. So I will say before I do, there are a couple more bullets about different types of voting rules that we can go into more in question and answering if you want to do that. But consensus is kind of the rule of the day. Tracy, you're up.
Thanks. Yeah, I think of consensus as getting to not know. All right, on observer attendance and engagement. Next slide, please. So I have been looking at the chat, and I think I can answer a couple of questions while talking about this. So first of all, the orange zone that Beth described in her schematic is what we actually call the blue. Well, actually, sorry, the whole thing was the blue zone. I apologize. But the orange part of it, that circle, was where the negotiations take place. And someone asked, is that orange really accessible? The answer is yes. As Beth noted, in each of those settings, what a plenary, contact group, informals, those remain open. Plenaries, always contact groups, almost always, and almost always these days informals. It's only informals that tend to close or start with that presumption. So keep in mind that negotiations, that orange area, is accessible, but you have to have a badge. And so that's why this slide shows you the different kinds of badges there are. We observers who are NGOs get yellow badges. There's a whole range of them, as you can see. It's incredibly important to understand, one, that when the room, not because the parties would let us in, but when the room is filled up physically, fire code violations, that then there can be secondary badges given to parties. That's one of the examples up here, and tickets in the upper right given to observer organizations to distribute among their members. So that does affect accessibility, okay? But in general, it is meant to be fairly open. Finally, security. It is in the blue zone that is run by the UNFCCC. There are all kinds of rules about where our badges can let us into those rooms. And the key takeaway there is to respect the folks at the door monitoring things. In contrast, the green zone, which we don't know much about yet, is run by the country, and so the host country. So it will be Egypt that sets those rules. I'd recommend keeping an eye on the Egyptian COP27 presidency website. That's not the UNFCCC site, that's the Egyptian presidency site. If you just Google COP27 and Egypt, you'll see the URL. And that's where we'll get more information about the green zone. Okay, so next slide. You've got a badge, you know your color. One of the things that might interest you is to look at participation. So this is a great graphic the UNFCCC Secretariat put together about the numbers of people who participated at COPs over the years. So we're now getting onto the 27th COP. So look at basically COP 15 and forward. That's the middle bar that was so high. That was the one in Copenhagen in 2009. And you can see that since then, basically, COPs now average twice the number of people there, sometimes 3 and 4, that they did in the first 14 COPs. And that if you look just at COP 26, the bar to the right, you'll see that there are just a titch more country representatives there than there were observers. And then the smaller orange bar being media. So observers, we make up a high number of people who are participating. Next slide. So how does the parties really, through the Secretariat, manage all the observers? Well, they do so through constituencies. And that's the name given to the organization that Beth and I are the co-focal points. That's RINGO, which is the Research and Independent NGOs. We've listed the other 8 constituencies that are used to help observers, NGO observers, engage. There was one question about, is there a group representing Indigenous peoples and tribal nations? And I think that came up when I was giving the slide about the negotiating groups. There is not, those are country negotiating groups that are parties. And the Indigenous peoples, for example, individual tribes, are not parties to these treaties, the 3 treaties. But as you can see here, there is a constituency that's specifically for Indigenous peoples organizations. And that's the place within which that constituency that is helping tribal governments and Indigenous people engage. Next slide. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry, before we leave this, Beth, Youngo, one of the other questions in the chat was, where is youth voice? So Youngos is that constituency that will help young people engage and galvanize you and educate you, because I know they're doing a number of webinars as well. I also want to point out that many, or maybe not many, a fair number of country delegations have youth delegates from their country on the negotiation team, so that are actually on the delegation. So that's another way that youth be engaged. You especially see that in Europe. All right, next slide. And this basically shows how the constituencies break out. This is COP26, and here you go, CMP, so the protocol 16 and CMA 3. This is attendance. You'll see that ANGO which is environmental NGOs, is the largest percentage of NGO attendees. Ringo is the second, bingo the third, and down from there. And really, this slide tends to show, I think, two things. One, I didn't point out on the last one that Ringo is the only one of the 9 that is a non-advocacy constituency. So we advocate for good process and evidence-based policy making, but we don't advocate on particular specific negotiation issues, whereas the other 8 constituencies do. And ENGO in particular has 2 pieces to it. It has CAN International, which is one part of the ENGO membership, and DCJ, Demand Climate Justice, which is a second piece. Next slide, Beth. I just talked about Ringo, so I probably don't need to do too much more. Basically, the size, we tend to be, it's not just academic. A lot of us are teachers as well as researchers working in think tanks. We also, that independent part includes faith-based organizations, practitioners who do mediation, some folks who are in government, who, so for example, some of the parliamentarians are involved in Ringo. And you can see the different roles we play. And basically what we do and why we're involved in this webinar and why Beth and I co-wrote a chapter for this book on how to use negotiation sites for research is that we're basically trying to help people engage in the process as much as possible. Next slide. Finally, couple of things to point out. Beth already highlighted that it's not just the COP. So, but during the COP, you can do a lot of different things. So the NGO constituencies make statements in plenary. You'll have daily constituency meetings. You can come to the Ringo meetings every morning where we discuss a number of topics and share. You can go to negotiation sessions. Beth already mentioned, and she's going to go into more detail about the side events and pavilions and what's going on at COP27, and also the parallel events that take place outside of the COP. Throughout the year, I want to make sure that you, if you're interested in engaging throughout the year, to come to the next webinar where we'll talk about how to do that through the SBs, the subsidiary bodies, and the constituted bodies. And one last way, not only attending those bodies meetings, you can make submissions on particular topics of interest. So again, while Ringo doesn't do that as a constituency, our members make submissions all the time as they advocate on specific negotiation topics. I think that's it, Beth. Back to you. Oh, sorry. There's just some slides illustrating what it looks like. So there's side events and parallel events, and then the exhibits. We should both note we're not sure at this point how the exhibits are going to be handled at COP27. During the pandemic and having the first meeting, quote, after the pandemic last year, the exhibits were all virtual. And it's not clear at this point whether that's going to continue this year, if there will be some in person. Beth, I'll hand it over now to you. Let me say it one more time. Oh, dang. Okay.
We're not letting you off the hook that quick.
Well, etiquette does not mean drinking your tea like that. Basically, there is a code of conduct. You will see that at the UNFCCC COP27 website. It's right there. It's good to read it. Know that there's sensitivities around cameras at times, that you need to follow the guards letting you in or not letting you in a meeting room. You must know that the seats in the rooms, especially those that have placards for the countries, are for parties. There's spaces at one or two tables for the constituencies to sit, but basically observers sit toward the back of the room. And then on demonstrations, it's a good point that demonstrations within the venue, within the blue zone, need to be organized with the UNFCCC, with the Secretariat, and that those in the outside the venue are governed by, and those within the venue are governed by UNFCCC rules. And outside the venue, that's governed by Egyptian law. And again, we don't know exactly how that's shaped up at this point, but there will be more as we get closer to the COP in early November. Thanks.
All right. Now back to me. So I'm going to go quickly through this next section, but there's some tremendous questions that I want to make sure that we have time to in the Q&A. But somebody had asked before, these slides will be posted. So some of these you may want to take, some of the next slides might be helpful to just take and digest and look at in your own time. So I'll just give you a heads up on that. So really a huge question for me, and particularly as I work with my students, is what do we do when we get there? Like, right, we hear all this, we know all this, what do we do when we get there? Well, the first slide here I wanted to show, and this is a schematic that the Egyptian presidency has put together for how they envision the layout of COP27 being. So, you see here the entrance. This red area is the space that they have dedicated for side events. In the purple, you'll see the plenaries where they have space allocated for those large plenary meetings. And then the brown is meeting rooms. And typically meeting rooms are where your informals, your contact groups may be in plenary, that might be in a large meeting room. Your informals will be in these meeting rooms. So this is a sense of the blue zone. Somebody had asked, what is open to me? Like Tracy said, if you have a badge, you have full access to this area. You may not have access to every room within the area, depending on what type of negotiation is happening and what the parties have decided as to whether it is open or closed. There's a big effort to push to as much to be open as possible. So for informals, the first and last informal generally should be open, and the middle ones as well, unless a party asks for it to be closed. And I actually saw at the subsidiary meetings that their parties asked for an informal to actually be open. So that was unusual, but well received. So going on to the next slide here, and I've also seen questions on where do I find documents and how do I find schedules? So this page may or may not be familiar, and this is the UNFCCC website. And the next couple of things I'm going to show you are things you can do before you get there, in order to be up to speed on the particular negotiation agenda issues that you are interested and care about. So the UNFCCC did update their website over the weekend. So these slides do show the pictures of the new streamlined website, but just if it looks a little different, there was an update. So one of the things that you'll see session pages. And as Tracy described, these are the large meetings that are happening: the COP, the CMA, the CMP, and the 2 subsidiary body meetings. Then on the next, what I love are the provisional agendas and annotations. So you can click on each of those, and you can click on that session page, and you can see the details of what's happening within that SUBSTA session. So, right, this is a subsidiary body for technological advice. This particular body supports all 3 treaties, right? So it will work to help, it'll help move forward. Will help work move forward under the different treaties, and it has a large agenda. So these are the session pages. When you're in the session page, you can see the agenda of the session and you can see key documents. So the agendas and annotations. So if you're on the session page, for example, you can click here, provisional agenda and annotation, or if you're back here on the main page, you can click provisional agendas and annotations. There are multiple ways to get to the same thing through the UNFCCC site. This we particularly highlight because I find it very informative as you're getting ready to go to COP, to see here's what's on the agenda. Here are all the agenda items, but not just what's on the agenda, but the annotations in particular are helpful. The annotations will give you, and so this, for example, is about the adaptation committee. It'll give you the background. How did this come to be on the agenda? Some key steps. It'll highlight the action. What is it that they're expecting to happen on this particular agenda item at this meeting, right? So they're telling you that coming up during the COP27, the SBI and SUBSTA, because this is a joint agenda item, some agenda items are on both agendas. They're considering the 2022 report, and they're recommending draft conclusions or a draft decision resulting from implementation of the work plan. So you kind of know, okay, here's what they're working towards. Then it will have links to key documents. So if you're trying to get up to speed and prepare for what you might see, the annotated agendas are a great place to get started. I also wanted to go back here to the session pages. I find these really helpful. They have the agenda on the session page. During the COP, you will find, at least for me, this is my go-to place to find documents related to each agenda item as they're created and posted. Again, there's multiple places to get to the same thing, but this is a handy tool, a handy place for me to go to. This one, I'm going to go by quickly. No, it's in the slides. There's lots of different documents. This will help you understand by document number and name what a document might actually be and how much standing, I guess would be a word, how much standing or credence that document may have within the context of the process. So this, I will say this is borrowed from COP26, because if when I showed you several slides ago, when I first showed you the meetings and the provisional agendas, what we saw was sessions and agendas, but we didn't see all of the other tabs yet. So the website just has not yet been populated. So at COP26, though, what I wanted to highlight in particular is this is a nice tool to go to. You will have access to the side event schedule. You'll have access to pavilions. Mission pavilions are a place where countries, they will also have side events and other events. You can click on pavilions and get that particular schedule. You can easily access the daily program, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, and the CCTV schedule, which is the handy schedule that you want to be able to go to very quickly to see exactly what's happening at what time and in what location. Okay, next real quick is the daily program. When it comes out each day, usually in the middle of the night. It'll be one of the first reads each morning while you're there, to go to the daily program to see what is happening when. Side events will be scheduled way ahead of time. You'll be able to look and kind of get an idea on those before you even leave or go to Egypt. Negotiation meetings, typically, if you're in a plenary, you might hear it's going to be this day, and this day. But oftentimes you don't get that confirmed till the morning, the night of, or the morning of, the night before, the morning of a meeting happening. So you would want to check and see what meetings were happening. Also, and I saw, oops, didn't mean to click. I saw a question in the chat too. So you hear I have this highlighted member meetings of observer organizations. So all observer organizations typically have coordinating meetings, and they're typically daily coordinating meetings. So you'll see here that the Ringo coordinating meeting happened from 9 to 9:45 every day during COP, and that's a typical time for us to meet, as well as daily. But all the constituencies have coordinating meetings. There was a question about, are those always open? Some constituencies are open and others do a fair bit of strategy sessions. So that can be a bit, it depends. I think that's just the best answer to that. Sometimes constituencies may say, yeah, come on in. Another time they may say, no, this is closed to constituency members only. Also up here, you'll notice these are the negotiating groups that Tracy mentioned earlier. These are pretty much always closed. I would not recommend trying to go into the G77 strategy session. That would not be recommended. So on the daily program, as an example, if you were to click here on the subsidiary body for implementation, it takes you, this is the CCTV. So, right, so if you were back a couple of slides and you clicked on CCTV, you would also get here. So you'll find what your shortcuts are. But within the CCTV, for example, you see that there is an informal consultation and national adaptation plans. And that's an agenda item on the SBI agenda. It'll tell you what meeting room it's in, and then it'll also tell you notes. That is often where it will say open or closed. If it doesn't have a note, you can presume that it's open. If it's closed, it'll typically say closed to parties or a note along those lines. Okay, so I'm gonna highlight this as a quick read. The daily program, the ENB, is a factual reporting of what's happened. Eco Newsletters has perspectives each day from the environmental NGO perspective, and the Third World Network does blog updates from the developing world perspective. They're great daily reads. You'll be able to click and access those from the slides. This is our website. Tracy highlighted about Ringos. You'll be able to find a lot of information leading up to COP on our website, and we will have a COP27 page that is as yet to be created that will provide information, logistical information about Ringo meetings, any particular constituency specific information and ways to get in touch with us as well. Thank you. See you at COP, and let's hit the questions. We got 10 minutes, so we ran over just a little bit.
Good job, Beth. That was so good. I think everyone's appreciative of all that content. I was actually going to start maybe closer to the bottom on some of these questions because they deal with what you were just talking about, which is kind of how to navigate it. And, this idea of like, how does the conference actually feel as a running gigantic conference? So someone asked, like, how efficiently can this conference function with thousands and thousands of participants? This is more just like your gut feel, you know, when you show up and there's masses of people, where are most people filtering through and how do you navigate that whole thing?
So I think it's a great question. I think parties, for the most part, are there to engage in the negotiation sessions. Now, you do have some parties that bring additional members or have party overflows, but they're there to participate in negotiation sessions. Observers are there for a range of reasons. They're there to observe the negotiations, to engage, to influence, to advocate, to help guide the negotiations in a direction perhaps that they would like to see them go. They're also there to participate in side events, to showcase or show knowledge and share knowledge with one another and network with one another. So I think, Tim, kind of the first part of your question is it depends on what your goal is when you go to the COP as to what your day or how you might navigate that space might be. And I see Deborah has a couple of questions about what do we focus on. I mean, I'm happy to give my example. I teach a class on the negotiations. When I first went, we were like, oh my gosh, what do we follow? I was completely overwhelmed. What we do now in the class that I teach is we have specific agenda items and the students follow those particular agenda items. And so they're prepped on those agenda items, they follow them. We're doing them to help support an international NGO to help build capacity with that NGO in terms of knowledge on those agenda items. So they attend, they take notes, they go to side events that relate to those agenda items. So that's what my students do. With party delegations, depending on the size of the delegation, right? You'll see certain members of that party delegation will be responsible for certain agenda items. And they may have those agenda items that relate, like you'll see adaptation, loss and damage, the same negotiators perhaps on some of those agenda items, which actually will lead to some logistical issues that you'll hear in sessions of, no, we can't have that meeting then. I can't be there. I can't be in two places. And you start to see some of the equities in terms of size of negotiations and how different parties are stretched then to get to places that are critically important.
Yeah, and I would just give one perspective from an NGO side, which is what we are. We spend probably equal times in the kind of the formal negotiation spaces and the pavilion areas. So a lot of the pavilion areas are those places that we go to. You know, if the governor of Michigan is going to come from the US, the US pavilion will be the place where that person will give, you know, some announcement about whatever new thing they want to do on EVs in Michigan. I have no idea if they will, but that would be great if they did. So things like that happen in that kind of cordoned off pavilion space. Tracy, I wonder, do you have any comments about your feeling on that kind of the event itself as a whole?
I saw the efficiency question. First of all, you know, Glasgow was, I think, north of 30,000 people. And somehow we managed to test every morning, get the okay to come in. We all come through the same security area. So you get to see a lot of people there, and that's where the most lines are in terms of efficiency, inefficiency. But basically, everybody, what the last part that Beth did with you, everybody is following negotiation agendas, like you just pointed out, Tim, as an NGO, to some degree. And pretty much everybody is attending some measure of the side events. So understanding those schedules, plotting those out beforehand, the daily program for the negotiation sessions, the COR schedule for the side events, that's key. And then my last point is everybody needs to go to the bathroom and get food and coffee as the days and nights go on. So there are coffee points distributed around. You'll see the COP27 map that Beth showed anticipates that. There's food around, and it's a great time to meet new people, especially those outside of your bubble.
Great, and just a couple maybe logistic things too in the questions. On the side event side, I see that Marianne mentions they'll have a shared pavilion. So this is a good example of ways in which content is generated by the people who run those pavilions. So I know we participated in the America's All In Pavilion, and other countries will bring people, different speakers at different times. So if you are either part of or know folks who are overseeing a pavilion, that's usually a pretty good way to get some space. And that's a little bit different than the official UN side events that have been approved. So some of you, if you didn't get approved there, you may want to check in with some folks you might know in a pavilion. I wanted to pivot a little bit back to the beginning question, and Marianne had some really interesting questions around the NDCs and this kind of like some of the process stuff. So like, how are those, her first question is, how are they verified? But then secondly, like, how binding are there? And so is there anything people can do either when they go to the COP to say, you know, you need to be taking these NDCs more seriously, or is there any other mechanisms they can do for this NDC piece? And then maybe a relationship to the past treaty with Kyoto, like how it relates to Kyoto.
In less than 2 minutes. Okay.
Yep.
So
No, Tracy, go.
ready? Great questions. NDCs are verified by experts. And there's also a facilitative review process that you can watch live at the COPs. So they are verified externally through other members, treaty members. So it's a body, an expert body of treaty members. Second, you're correct, I think it's Marianne, that NDCs in and themselves, it's not legally binding to achieve them. And I know that seems pretty odd, but it is legally binding under international law once you are a treaty member, when you ratified it, to make an NDC, to participate in the enhanced transparency process. So those reports are part of what enable the verification process, as well as to show progress on it. The global stocktake is considered the ultimate way to make sure that we hold treaty members accountable. But I agree completely. Under NDCs, the political work is in your home country. And we have lots of examples of it. Marianne, I think you mentioned New Zealand, but certainly you've all been following the cases like in Urgenda in the Netherlands, where litigants challenged the Netherlands government for being essentially insufficient on their pledges on the NDCs. That is going on around the world. And we know in the United States, while we're way behind our European colleagues and UK colleagues, that now with the Inflation Reduction Act, we're doing more. So yes, many countries need to take steps within their countries in order to make the NDCs happen, and they need political will to do it. So that's where you should influence, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Tracy. And just a reminder that the COP is 2 weeks in a given location, but all throughout the year and through the years, these, you know, negotiations are happening, and there's tons of influence that you can put at the country level or your local, more local level to make sure that it gets translated up through, even if it feels so opaque in the moment of the COP, you know, where they're just coming together to do these negotiations. One last question, maybe on, looks like there's a few questions about research, and I guess I'm curious, maybe the theme of research, how does that weave itself through the COP? Is there active roles for researchers in different you know, parts of the COP formal process, or is it really in the informal space where most of the researchers engage? Beth or Tracy?
Tracy and I are looking at each other to see who wants to take that one. So
I just spoke, you go.
Okay, so you know, I think this is a question Tracy and I get a lot, and candidly, there is a gap between sometimes what happens in the negotiation rooms and party needs and what happens within research, and there's lots of reasons for that. But one area, and I'm going to, again, we're plugging webinar too, one area that we definitely see clear opportunities within the negotiation process for researchers to engage is through these constituted body meetings that happen throughout the year, and the expert meetings. Those are smaller groups, topically specific, and researchers are able to attend through the constituency to attend. And some of those, there's opportunities not just to observe, but opportunities to participate and to have dialogue with the parties on that topic. And are we still here? Are we still here? Yes, okay, my screen share just went off, and so my computer kind of threw me for a loop there. So dialogue. Another great opportunity within the COPs is for researchers to network with one another, share information through side events, pavilions, attending Ringo meetings, making connections with other researchers. And we also within Ringo have a couple of focus groups where researchers come together, and one, for example, around oceans in the cryosphere is an area where we're working to connect researchers with similar interest in the COP process on different topics. So I know it is 7. I think we're running on time.
Yep. Hopefully you see the screen.
I can stay for a little bit longer and answer questions if that's an option.
And I can as well.
Okay, so why don't we just wrap it up so people can understand what can happen in the future and know that Beth and Tracy can stay on, and we'll leave the webinar going for a bit. Just wanted to mention two things. One is that we've mentioned these future webinars. So if you go to secondnature.org/COP webinar series, you can see we just completed this one. We have one coming up on October 3rd, all about bodies. We all like to talk about bodies. So that's what that one's all about. And then webinar 3 are more focused on the issues. So really digging into the substance. So be sure to flag these on your calendar, and same registration, same format, different speakers. I wanted to give one big thank you to Mia Sen on our staff. All these things happen without, they can't happen without people behind the scenes, and Mia has been running this webinar, and really appreciate her work in putting this together. And once again, really grateful for Tracy and Beth, as well as the UC3 for all the support and getting the planning going, including Marjorie Kaplan, I think, who might still be listening, but from Rutgers, who has really helped coordinate this whole series together. So we're really thankful for that. It was the first time we've done this in this multi-series way. So, okay, so I just wanted to get that out of the way. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and Beth and Tracy, just want to keep going for maybe another 10 minutes or so, or however long.
And I would just, and I'll just pick up with the research piece, because I see some of the questions that we didn't quite hit yet. So one, there is a research day. So there's a science day, they're calling it, which is both hard and soft sciences, or social and physical sciences. But you'll see that the thematic days that are on the Egyptian presidency's COP27 website, they're outlined with the days and the themes. They're also going to include research in all those different themes. Second, the research we tend to think about is like the physical science, and we've all been watching the IPCC working group reports come out throughout this year. So there will be special briefing sessions by the IPCC authors to bring research into the negotiations. They tend to focus more on the parties, but those are open sessions for everyone. And then the last thing is, there were several questions I saw about submissions. And one thing to keep in mind is that as researchers, the researchers among you, as much as you can, again, I'm going to get back to my friend Beth's part of the presentation, understand the agendas, right? The agendas are not the daily program, but they are the topics that the COP has set for itself by consensus to refine within this treaty regime. And so what they do at every COP, in almost every, well, okay, not every, but in many decisions, they ask for submissions on specific topics that are on the agenda. So as much as researchers can get to know these agendas, and if not tailor, at least apply some of their research to answering those questions, you can keep track after each COP and there's a place on the UNFCCC website to submit of the questions, and you can take your research and answer those questions and submit it. That is by delegation, not by constituency. Just want to be clear about that. But that's just some other ways of getting research into the process. Other questions we want to address, Beth? I can take
so I see two that I think are related to one another. Joran has a question about minutes, and I'm taking that to be minutes from the negotiating sessions. And then the Anonymous has a question about video recording or photos recording. So kind of pulling those together, photos are generally allowed throughout the venue. Video and audio recording is not. It is not permissible in the negotiation sessions. Minutes for the different sessions are not provided. So a formal minutes from the negotiators or from the Secretariat are not provided. You will see documents, and if you go and look at kind of that chart I had of different types of documents, you will see posted on the session pages under the agenda items progress in the form of various types of documents you can find. Another place, though, for a more detailed record is that we do have the Ringo constituency on our Ringo website does post meeting notes. So if there are observers attending, taking notes of what's happening in a meeting, we're happy to post those notes. And so that is going to be the closest thing you might have to a minute of what's happening in the meeting. So that is a place that you might go. Tracy,
And
anything to add
yeah,
there?
I would just add, instead of, you won't see something daily about photo, video recording, look at the code of conduct. It's very clear in there about what you can do. And then
I actually, well, two more things. I do think it's in the daily program every day, not to video.
oh, they put a little
I
disclaimer.
do think
Yeah.
there's a disclaimer in the daily program
Yeah.
each day. The other, as I mentioned at the very end, a really, really great tool is the, oh my goodness, not the eco, the, Tracy, help me out here.
Earth Negotiations Bulletin?
Yes, the ENB, the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, the ENB. So they are staffed with a terrific team of really experts on all of these topics who will be in negotiating rooms, who will take notes and provide a condensed factual summary of what happened in different negotiating rooms. So that's generally a place that I will go to if I'm not able to attend, to get a brief synopsis of what happened on that day in that room. For the most part, they try to hit all the negotiation sessions. They're not always in every one, but it is a good place to get a synopsis. It's not going to be minutes, but it'll be an overview.
I think the question on the biggest difference between week 1 and week 2 is a great one. And I just want to be clear. So the first week of COP27 is actually an SB meeting, a subsidiary body meeting. And so there's an intersessional one that takes place in May or June. And remember, those bodies are the ones that are processing these open questions that the COP has posed, that the COP then is going to take decision on in its decision at the end of the year. So they have a second part to the meeting, of the intersessional meeting, and it's the first week of the COP. The second week then is time for decision making. That's when you see more high-level politicians coming in. You'll see heads of ministries. It's the point at which red lines or orange lines need to be moved in negotiating. And someone asked, are many things decided really by the delegations before they get to the COP? Well, one, a lot is recommended. Those decisions are recommended at the SBs. But two, there's a number of meetings that take place. The St. Petersburg Dialogue, the Petersburg Dialogue, for example, New York Week, which is taking place where Tim is right now, where there's high-level ministerial meetings. This is happening practically every week since at least midsummer, if not before. So they are working toward getting closer on issues, convergence, because they're trying to be as close as possible before they get to the COP. But I wouldn't call that hammering it out between the delegations before the COP.
So Tracy, also Deborah asked about the fact that observing that most meetings are starting on the 8th and what's happening on the 6th and the 7th. You want to talk about that?
Well, it's not my favorite part of the COP. I'm really a first week gal. I like the technical part more than when rock stars and movie actors and politicians are walking around. But it's become a habit that the first day of the COP would be a high level ministerial. So that's what's happening, right? That's why Sunday is opening, right? Early, Beth? And I can't remember, that's taking place on Monday? Or is it taking place on Sunday?
I think it's Sunday and Monday.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, I was glad I was fudging it because
in the overview schedule, so this is something I didn't highlight, but there will be an overview schedule that highlights when all of these meetings, and it's not posted yet, but it's a good kind of framing of when everything opens and closes and what sessions are there. And that would be right there on that COP20 UNFCCC COP27 page.
And what you'll see as compared to all the other documents we've showed you, it's going to show a day by day overview of what's happening on each day. And so we are opening early. Usually we open on a Monday. We are opening on a Sunday. And part of that is to then give more time to these high level ministerial speeches, basically. And so that there aren't public negotiation sessions going on at that time. And then in the second week, there will be another level of a ministerial. Sometimes it's 1 day, sometimes it's 2 days. And that is usually around the politics of getting to not know. So getting to consensus. Looks like Tim is heading out. Did you see any other questions you wanted to answer, Beth?
Well, I do see for a graduate student going the first time, would you recommend first week? The department gave me the choice. I think I might. Yeah, if you have the choice, they're both exciting, they're both different. But yes, I think I'd go week one. Let's see, I'm scrolling.
There is an
through.
easy question here. How do we find the focal contact points for each constituency? Go to the UNFCCC website, Google constituencies, and you'll find a list. They maintain it and it's current. I also see somewhat about being there the first week and finding schedules. Beth walked you through that. This person is both with the Unitarian Universalists and the Women's Convocation. So do know that Ringo includes many faith-based groups. That's the I of Ringo. And that you also have the Women and Gender constituency meetings that you could attend as well. And I also should have said in response to that, how the flow of a COP, I really do think that using your constituency as a home can be a really good place. That's certainly the spirit that we foster in Ringo.
So there's a question about political context for academics and researchers in Egypt and whether Ringo has suggestions for conducting research safely while at COP27. Tracy, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I have to say I don't have the kinds of thoughts I'd like to answer precisely. What I can explain to you in terms of process is that Beth and I, as your CFPs, as Ringo CFPs, have been meeting with the presidency. We do that every month. And so we can take questions to them. And this could be a very interesting one to take, hasn't been discussed. We also meet with other academics in country. So we have a contact, and we've been also working with the UK, the COP26 UK University Climate, I think Alliance now it's called, or network. And so we can raise the issues that way. So we don't have definitive answers, I think in part because we haven't been hearing those questions from our membership. So this will help us. And that's the kind of information that we'll post on the website as well under our COP27 guide.
And I would also say that, you know, it in part depends on what type of research is being conducted. And if research is being conducted within the blue zone, or if a researcher is wanting to conduct research outside of the blue zone. And so I think that there's different answers or responses that, like Tracy said, we don't necessarily have the answer to, but thinking about what is the goal of the research and what is the best way to achieve it, and where will it be conducted and who will it involve, right? Those are the important questions.
That's a really good point, Beth. I think, though, I do want to be really clear. If you're conducting research within the blue zone, that is governed by the UNFCCC rules and that code of conduct. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it in Egypt or you're doing it in the UK, that would be consistent. So I think would be more concern about research being done outside the blue zone. And I'd be really happy for someone to email us. Our email addresses are at the Ringo website with your precise questions, because that would help us bring those questions to the presidency.
I think we may have touched on most all the questions. If we missed one, somebody wants to drop one in the Q&A real quick, but I think we may have touched. These are terrific questions, and we really appreciate your being here and engaging and asking.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through.
Okay, how to be a part of Ringo. So as Tracy, I'll answer that one as you're scrolling through, and then if we don't see any others, we can close up. So as Tracy talked about, observer organizations, when your organization submits all the paperwork to be an observer organization, there is a question about which constituency do you feel like you best affiliate with. And we have a slide of the 9 different constituencies. And so if you're part of an admitted observer organization, there should be a constituency connected with that observer organization. And if you're not sure which constituency you are, you can go to the UNFCCC website where they list all of the admitted observer organizations and their associated constituencies. That said, Ringo is open, and we welcome. One of our missions is to help educate and inform and connect and advocate. As Tracy said, we're non-advocacy constituency, though we do speak in favor of open and transparent processes. And so, you know, Ringo or not, you're welcome to join our listserv, come to our meetings, attend our webinars, and we're happy to have you.
Thanks. And thanks, Marjorie, for the kudos on addressing, at least it seems like almost all the questions. I did notice one on visas. How can we help you understand the visa process? Still a source of mass confusion in my world, says Anonymous. I'm happy to report that in these monthly meetings, all the constituencies, all 9 of them, are raising visa issues, and I expect there'll be more clarity soon. We've been pointing out where there isn't clarity. I think the easiest way, rather than conveying it verbally here, is for us to lay out our understanding once we get that from the presidency on the Ringo website. So go to the Ringo website, sign up for the listserv, and I guess when doing that, Beth, right, sign up for the blog posts as well. Follow. But we feel your pain about the visa process.
All right.
That's it.
Well, I think that's it. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Mia and Marjorie, for doing so much of the behind the scenes legwork of making this possible, and all of you attending. And we look forward to seeing everyone in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, see you at webinar 2.